and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ian McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nichol.
And today on the show, we are talking about murder houses. It is Friday the 13th that we are releasing this episode. And so, just a wee warning before we get into it, you might not want to listen to this one with your kids in the car because we're going to be talking about crime and maybe we're going to mention some things.
Especially if they're prone to hurting the cat.
Oh, terrible. This one has actually come because my partner, Kelly, is a big true crime fan. And for Friday the 13th, she wanted to talk about, well, if there is some unfortunate incidents, some crime, some happenings
Maybe she
within
wants
a property.
to know if it'll affect the value of your house while she bludgeons you to death.
Well, she wanted to know whether it has any impact. And there has been a surprisingly large amount of research done into this area, which we are going to get into today. But before we get into the actual house values, I want to talk about, well, what actually happens to a lot of murder houses or properties where there has been a murder or gruesome crime committed within a property. And a surprisingly large number of them end up getting burnt down. And that's for two reasons. The first is that there might be some sort of suspicious fire because a member of the community has decided that they don't want to see that sort of that reminder in the area. They don't want to see the house there as a reminder continuing there in the community. And so they burn it down. And this has actually happened in Hawke's Bay in 2019, Hamilton in 2018, and then Christchurch in 2009, what was known as the House of Horrors was suspiciously burnt down. And I believe it's some sort of remembrance park. But I did see some comments from a criminologist called Trevor Bradley talking about that often community members will burn down these houses in order to not be reminded of them, which is very, very interesting. Other times, the houses can be burnt down, but they're not as suspicious. So if we think about the David Bain case, where his family was unfortunately, it's hard, you've got to find a nice euphemism, bludgeoned?
No, they're shot.
Yeah, the kids might still be listening, Andrew. Well, we already said it. Don't bleep that out, David. Unfortunately passed on in that property. And that house was burnt down, but by the fire department. So sometimes these sorts
Destroying
of properties...
all evidence.
No, it was after all the evidence was taken. But 3 weeks after the crimes took place, as a training exercise, the fire department burned down the property. And they do this essentially for training because the properties have been donated. So the owner of a property might say, well, we don't want this house still standing because of the gruesome crime, so we'll donate it to the fire department who will burn it down. So very, very fascinating thing talking about that. But let's get into the details around the values, Andrew. If there is a crime in a house next to me, does it affect my property value? And what about the murder houses themselves?
So first, let's talk about the surrounding area. So the University of Technology in Sydney did a study which says that, yes, it does affect the value. So research into the houses around 300 metres of the crime scene shows that property prices were depressed by about 4% in the first year, and then over the next couple of years they recovered until the original sort of value. Has no impact on rents within the area, so Ed's put here, do tenants not care about that? Maybe they just don't really have a choice at that stage, and so they can't get a discount because there's been a murder down the road.
But great time, I suppose, just think of it another way.
To buy a house?
Yeah, to buy or renovate the area.
I think if you're dropping flyers house to house, maybe better just to go and commit a wee murder.
No, Andrew, but if you see something in the paper, buy the house next door because you'll be able to buy it under value, rent it out to the tenants who don't care. It's a form of instant equity.
Proactive, okay. But let's talk about the house itself. So that obviously has much more of an impact, particularly if this crime was recent and it's been in the media, which tends to be the case, and or if the market is cool. In Palmerston North, most of you will remember where Mark Lundy allegedly murdered his wife. I mean, he's been convicted of it. He is appealing, but is convicted of murdering his wife and daughter in 2000. That property was sold in December 2002. The property was valued at $106,000, but only sold for $70,500, which is interesting because I do think there are the type of people out there that will buy something because of its media appeal. But then I guess obviously
I'm not sure if you would call that media appeal.
well, you know,
Andrew.
just people like to feel connected to that kind of excitement of it. There are crazies in the world. But having said that, I do also remember reading about any of you that have watched the great movie, The Silence of the Lambs, the house where the main killer there, Jim something or other, had Clarice Starling in the basement. That property went up for sale in the USA relatively recently. And again, they really struggled to sell it. And that was just a movie.
How fascinating. And the other thing that's important to
James Gunn.
It's important to note here as well is around recent media attention. So I know with the Mark Lundy case, they tried to sell it a couple of years after that fact, after 2002. But the issue was that Lundy was in the media for court cases. And so the house was back in the spotlight. So depending on the case and the crime, the stigma might hang around for decades. If it was the David Bain house and it was still around, you know, people would still know what it was, especially if it was in the local area.
And actually, I remember one of my clients telling me that she was having real difficulty selling her house, wanted to move out of the neighbourhood because of an event that had happened. This is in Wellington. And she said that she was having real trouble selling her house because it was across the road from some people who were gang affiliated. Anyway, one night, one of the lady, one of the girlfriends of this gang member, ran out of the house, ran across the road, was chased by a gang member, and then he put an axe through her head on this lady's front yard. Anyway, that
I can't believe you're telling this story. I didn't think we were going to get this gruesome.
well, these things just jump into my head, and so she was having trouble getting rid of that house.
I can imagine why people didn't want to buy it. Probably not just the stigma, but the people within the neighbourhood.
Sizable front yard.
Well, let's talk about, what if the housing market's hot? So if the housing market is cool and there's a lot of properties around and, you know, up for sale, fewer buyers around, then of course this would have an impact. If the housing market is hot, it has less of an impact. And my evidence for this is back in 2011, a Sydney man had unfortunately murdered his girlfriend within an apartment.
I love how you say unfortunately, like you're softening it.
Well, it was unfortunate.
Oh, it's very unfortunate, but he didn't unfortunately murder her. He planned to murder her.
4 years later, the apartment was, gosh, Andrew, I can't believe this. 4 years later, the apartment was passed at an auction under the reserve, so which I believe was like 2.25 million. Market heated up. 2 months later, it sold for 2.5 million. And that was
deal.
And the apartment, actually, there was a similar apartment that sold for 2.6 million in the same building. Now, my message to you is not, there was a 100K discount because one sold for 2.6, one sold for 2.5. My key message there is, hey, it seems like after that 4 year period, even though it was relatively high profile, it just didn't really matter anymore at that point. But let's talk about, what happens if you own a murder house? And Andrew, I know you're going to give us a bit of a story in a second, but there actually is now some guidelines for real estate agents about whether you have to disclose that somebody was murdered within the house or whether a specific crime had happened within the house if you are selling it. And initially, Andrew, it's quite interesting. The Real Estate Authority had alleged misconduct for a real estate agent who had decided not to disclose that a crime had happened within the property. And actually, this property was up for sale by two different agents, one from Century 21, one from Barfoot's. Barfoot's chose not to disclose. Century 21 chose to disclose. Barfoot's ended up selling the property. Now, the new buyers took Barfoot's to the Real Estate Agents Authority. The REA alleged misconduct, but that was overturned at the High Court.
Wow.
And since then, the High Court has put down some guidelines about, should real estate agents disclose or should they not? But before we actually get into those, why don't you tell your story about what happened in Australia?
Okay, because I do want to hear the end of that. So a friend of mine based in Auckland, he and I were having a conversation one time. We were just sitting around having a beer. And the topic of rentals came up. Jolene was there, slumlord millionaire, and
former has been on the show,
but previously on the show, and she was talking about some of the things that she'd had because they'd had to clear out a body or something. I can't remember at one stage. Anyway. Trent said, no, I've got one. So basically, he and his brother bought this house in Phillip Island, which is about 2 hours out of Melbourne in Australia, and it's a relatively small town. And they were at the races one day, and the Melbourne Cup, and something came up that there were a lot of police down this particular street. And he thought, I own a house down that street. It was a bit of a laugh. They said, look at it on the news. Unfortunately for him, it was less of a laugh when he discovered that the tenants had lured back a youngish girl and said they were taking her fishing and chopped her up.
It's because you said it in that way. Honestly, Andrew.
Anyway, this is.
I could just imagine the headlines: property commentators laugh at death.
Anyway, so they lured back this young girl and said they were going to take her fishing and then chopped her up. So I guess unless they're going to dump her in the sea, then the fishing was a lie as well. So not only a murderer, a liar. And so they obviously find out about this. They think, oh, this is a nightmare. They had trouble renting the house, so they thought what we're going to do is just sell it because we just want to be rid of it. They could not move that property for any value at that stage. They ended up doing extensive renovations on the house and still lost a significant amount of money on that. So he was pretty upset about that. I mean, the problem was every time that they would do something, so once they finished the renovations, they put it back on the market, and the Herald ran with the headline, 2-page spread, house to die for.
The trouble is you also can't claim that back, the loss of value back against your tenants, which is the real issue there, isn't it?
Well, they're in jail.
But let's come back to what happens if you're wanting to sell them and some disclosure requirements. So if something does need to be disclosed, the real estate agent must get permission from the vendor to disclose it. So if you're the real estate agent and you know about it and you think, I need to tell buyers this, you first must get permission from the vendor. And if the vendor says, no, I don't want to tell anybody that, then the guideline says that you should not sell the property. You should stop listing the property.
Really?
But you don't have to tell everybody who comes to the open home. You don't have to advertise it. You just have to tell people who are making an offer or have the intention of making an offer, so before they actually make it.
So if someone says, I'd like to make an offer on this house, you go, okay, just
one thing.
Just before you do that, just one minor thing. Just step into the living room here.
That's basically it. But here's the thing. If you're the vendor, you don't have to tell the real estate agent that it was a murder house. You know, you don't have to disclose that yourself. Though we'll talk about what happens if you don't disclose it in a second in regards to property management. And not every murder would have to be disclosed. So there was a really interesting case around a suicide in a garage. And it was determined by, I think this was actually the High Court in this instance, that because it wasn't within the living areas, it was in the garage and it was a year prior and there had been tenants living in the property in the interim, that it didn't need to be disclosed. Wow. So there are some things, guidelines, I guess, that the High Court is saying. So you can consider, well, was it on the grounds of the property or was it within the house itself? Was it within the living areas? How much time has passed? What was the actual crime or what was the unnatural death that happened? That's the terminology used. And the level of local notoriety. So the idea is that if everybody in the local area knows about it and knows that it happened and somebody was buying the property who wasn't in the local area, then you'd need to inform that purchaser because there needs to be the same information across the market. So you would need to say disclose in that specific instance. But if somebody died because they were old and it was a natural death, for anything that wasn't these other more gruesome things, then you wouldn't need to disclose that because that's a natural part of life. But what about, talk to us about disclosing to your tenants, because this is actually tougher.
So there's a really interesting case. In 2019, some tenants managed to break their lease on an Auckland property and they went through the tenancy tribunal who said that it was okay for the tenants to break their lease and that the landlord couldn't recoup the costs. The landlord hadn't told the property management company that there'd been this event happen at the house. The interesting thing is the crime was back in 2010. It was 9 years prior. Crazy. But yet, because of this, the tenancy tribunal sided with the tenants and said that the landlord should have disclosed this information, and because they failed to do so, and the fact that there'd been this violent homicide and an arson incident that had occurred, even though it was back in 2010, they let them leave that property earlier than they were supposed to.
Other thing in that instance is there've been significant renovations done as well. So, I think this is probably a bit long. I think it's a bit ridiculous, really.
Yeah, I think so too.
And look, Andrew, just before we ramp up, I also want to talk about some other cultural suspicions. And this actually came up at our recent Auckland podcast dinner, where we took 10 of you lovely listeners, past partners, out to dinner up in Auckland. And I had a great conversation with, I'm pretty sure it was Janice. Janice, thanks for listening to the show, by the way, and coming along to that. Really enjoyed really enjoyed our conversation. And I believe, if I remember through the wine-induced haze.
It was a bit hazy for you at that stage of the night, wasn't it?
Definitely. Really enjoyed that conversation, Janice, and we were talking about how number 4 is really unlucky in Chinese culture, and the reason behind that is that when translated, it rhymes with death, with the Chinese word for death or the Mandarin word for death, and so when you go into some buildings in China, they won't have a level 4,
I'm pretty sure Sky
14,
City doesn't have,
or 24.
I'm pretty sure Sky City misses certain floors.
Yeah, so it might go level 3, 3A, 5, 6, 13. 13A,
As an economist,
15.
that must make you spin around in your chair.
Well, not if it means that you can make more money from the property. But I do think that it's really interesting. It seems to me that some of that is changing a bit in New Zealand, and we were talking that some people are becoming less suspicious around these things. I remember seeing a study that the number 13 didn't scare anybody off in New Zealand, and you'd happily buy property.
No. I've worked with Asian clients who have been fussy on which numbers they choose for that very reason.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Anyway, Kelly, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you realise this will not affect the value of your house when Ed's finally got too much for you. And you can't be blamed.
No. You just have to wait a couple of years. But feel sorry for the neighbours, at least for the first 2 years. Hey, let's wrap it up there. But please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you want to learn more about how to get the money to invest in property, come along to our next webinar. It's happening this Tuesday, 17th of August at 7 p.m. We've got along our good friend Peter Norris, who is a mortgage broker at Callis Financial. We're going to be digging into the numbers. I'm going to drop a link to that in the show notes, so tap or swipe over the cover up, link in there. Otherwise, just go to opuspartners.co.nz. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Edric Knight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
And we're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.